Hello and welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch, the podcast that aims to break down taboos and start open, honest conversations about death and dying. I'm Jason Davidson. I'm a social worker by profession, and I've worked in palliative care, hospice care, and bereavement support services for more than a decade. Each episode, we'll be speaking to a well-known guest to find out about how they feel about their own mortality and how their personal experience of bereavement has shaped the way they live their life. Today, I'm on the Marie Curie Couch with Michaela Strachan. Michaela's a TV presenter who's regularly appeared on our screen since 1986. She's fronted a variety of programmes from The Hitman and Her and The Really Wild Show to Countryfile and Springwatch. Michaela began her career presenting children's programmes, but these days she's best known as a wildlife presenter and has travelled all over the world filming animals and conservation projects. Michaela Strachan, welcome to On the Marie Curie Couch. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, Jason. I'm delighted to be on the Marie Curie Couch. Thank you for having me.
Good. One of the aims of the podcast is to encourage conversations around death and dying and grief and bereavement. And I'd like to start by asking if you could tell me about a significant bereavement that you've experienced in your life.
Last year was a really sad year, actually, Jason. There was a lot of loss in my close circle of family and friends, starting off at the beginning of the year with the passing of my sister-in-law, who died of cancer, and she suffered for 3 years and eventually passed in January. And that's very difficult for my family because my partner lost his wife to cancer, and so it sparks all sorts of memories for the whole family. And obviously for her close family, it was a very, very difficult time. Not long after that, my partner's best friend died of a heart attack. So, something very different again. After that, one of my best friends lost her 30-year-old son. Well, he was 35. And obviously that's, again, a very, very different circumstance. And I mean, just heartbreakingly sad to watch a mother go through that kind of loss. And to see the whole family. He had a 1-year-old child. He was married. He had brothers. We're very close to all of them. And it was just unbelievably sad to watch that family go through that loss. And then the one for me that was so poignant was my best friend died of breast cancer. And I suffered from breast cancer myself 10 years ago. And she had a very similar breast cancer to myself. She had a very similar diagnosis to myself. That was, we've caught it early. It's a small bit of cancer in one breast. We'll do a mastectomy. We'll put you on tamoxifen. You'll be fine, which is exactly the same as I had. And here I am 10 years later and I am fine. My friend wasn't so lucky and hers came back and it spread and we lost her last year. And so, I walked that journey with my friend Lucy. And so that hit me really hard. Losing Lucy hit me hard. And then at the beginning of this year, my 96-year-old mother-in-law passed. And, that is a very, very different circumstance compared to losing my friend, compared to a friend losing her child. So I feel in the last sort of 12 months that we've gone through so many very different losses. And at one stage, I must say, it felt like a little bit of a duvet of sadness on top of me that you had to keep pushing up because it just seemed relentless. The bad news and the sadness just was enveloping. So I feel as if I've come up from air from that sadness. But it was just really, really tough and really tough to try and stay positive, cheerful and find your smile when you've got all of that going on.
A huge amount of loss, and I think as you just described as well, really different deaths with people who you had very different relationships, but all connected through you and your partner and all close people. And, I was just thinking when you were talking there about, well, if grief's a process, how do you start or begin the process for one when another one comes along? Then what happens with that for the first one, and then a third one, and a fourth one, and a fifth one?
Yeah, I think the hardest thing to begin with is how to know how to deal with the people whose loss is closest. So, how to deal with the best friend who lost her child. Because I think any mother, that's, it's that sort of thing that is so big that no one ever recovers from that. My friend will never be the same again. And she's the most amazing woman. She's a yoga teacher. She's one of those women that walks in a room and lights a room up. And you know that light will never be as bright again because she's lost a child. And knowing how to help and be there for that friend was very difficult. Some of the time you felt you got it right. Some of the time you felt you just weren't quite getting it right. Being there for my best friend who died of cancer, who knew she didn't have long. She was given 3 months to a year and she lived over a year. So she exceeded the length that she was given. And knowing how to be with her and with her family was, really difficult, very difficult. But I felt I got it right. I felt I was a real support for my friend Lucy. And I think because I'd gone through the journey a little bit myself, a much more fortunate journey and a much, obviously, a more positive outcome than hers. But I think because we'd started the journey together, I could be a great help to her. And I felt that I knew what to say, when to say it, and how to support her and her family. And I was there right until the end with her. I was there for the 3 days before she died. And on the day she died, I left the home and I was filming the next day because nobody knew if it would be hours or whether it'd be weeks. And I went filming and I filmed parakeets that day for the One Show, the BBC One Show. And I could see my phone had rung and I could see it was her husband. And I knew before I phoned him back. And that was probably the hardest filming day I've ever done because we continued filming. Everyone was there and we were up in Manchester and I felt that we had to keep filming. But I will always look at parakeets in a positive way now because they remind me of Lucy. I was filming parakeets when my friend Lucy died, and I find that a really nice symbol. Every time I see a parakeet now in London or the outskirts or in Manchester, I smile and think of her. And I try and turn these things into positives because Lucy was loud. She was bossy. She was colourful. Everybody loved her. She was always surrounded by people. And, there are so many symbols of parakeets that match that. And so I always look at parakeets now and smile and think of the best things that I can think about of my friend Lucy. And in fact, just the other day, I bought something to take to her mum to put on her grave, which I got made, which is a metal bird that looks like a parakeet with a bright red beak that we're going to put by her grave so I can smile every time I go to her grave and think of her and the parakeets. And as I say, that's what I've tried to do with my grief, is to try and remember all the positive things and not let the last few days be the memory.
I love that. It's so beautiful. I just love that. I can't remember where it came from now, but I did hear a story about robins being the sort of, somebody's described robins as the souls that had kind of gone before. So that a robin was always a representation of somebody who died. And if a robin came close to you, flew next to you, sat on the back of the park bench, if you were sitting on a park bench or at your feet, probably looking for food, but that actually it was the person who died. And I love the colourful parakeets and the thought of that. It's so lovely. Can I ask, Michaela, with Lucy, just going back to when Lucy was told that her prognosis was going to be shorter. So she was looking at, as you said, 3 months to a year. Did you and Lucy, or did Lucy with other people, have conversations about death and dying, her own death?
That's an interesting question, because I remember the first time I saw Lucy after she had that diagnosis. I was driving from Surrey to around Bath where she lives. And I was thinking, how do I play this? What do I say? How do I behave when I turn up at the house of somebody who's been told they're not going to live? And I really analysed that and went through all different scenarios in my head and all different conversations in my head. And I arrived, and all those conversations that I'd planned disappeared because I found the right words and I found the right thing to say. And we went and sat together, and it was very, very emotional. And she said to me that, you know, she wasn't going to survive, and she'd planned her funeral, she'd planned everything. She was somebody that she liked control, Lucy, and she liked planning. She liked to be organised. And she talked me through it all. And she said to me, I want you to be someone that reads something or says something at my funeral, Mick. And she said, and if you can't be there for any reason, I don't want you to beat yourself up because I know what you're like. But if you can be there, I'd like you to say something on behalf of the television community. And so, you know, that's the way we were talking. And then when she finished, I said, right, Lucy, I want you to park that now. You've thought about your funeral. You've planned it all, and I understand why you've done that. But now you park it and you live the rest of your life. And obviously, you've got to have in your diary chemo every week. And you put something in your diary every week that you look forward to. And whether that's just walking up the lane, if that's all you can manage, you put it in your diary as something that you will try and achieve that week. And I said, and let's start with going out to lunch. I'm going to take you and the family out to lunch. And she said, I don't think I can. I said, yes, you can. You can. Let's do it. So we went out to lunch. And afterwards, she said to me that was a turning point for her because she realised she could do that. And then my friend Lucy, boy, did she live her last few months or her last year. She put things in her diary every day. I mean, she really took that to heart. And suddenly she was going to see concerts with her kids and she was going away, and she really lived her last year. And she was the most inspirational person and just never made anyone feel awkward after that. And I've got so much admiration for how she lived that last year that we now have a saying, let's live like Lucy, because she lived, you know, she knew she was dying and she lived right up until the last 3 weeks, I guess. When she phoned me, she was in hospital and I was going over to the UK because I live in Cape Town in South Africa, was planning to go to the UK, planning to see her anyway, because every trip she was my priority, because obviously I realised that time was short. And we had some really good times together in that last year. And she said, Mick, I think I should let you know I'm in hospital. She said, the bug has spread to my brain. And it was her birthday. And she sent me a picture of her with a silly hat on and a cake. And, you know, this is when it's gone to her brain. She knows that's it. And she was, I mean, just unbelievable. And then when she was sent home, and I went to see her when she was sent home, it was almost as if she'd stopped the fight. You know, she was living her life as best she could up until that point. And I don't know, I mean, this is just my perception of it. But the way I saw her in the bed, in her lounge, I thought, you know that there's no point in fighting anymore. And actually, to me, she went really peacefully. She went within 4 days, really, of me seeing her. And it was very quick from her being in bed and being able to communicate with us. She had her eyes closed a lot of the time, and it was, she wasn't able to say too much, but she could communicate. So the next day, when it was very difficult to understand what she was saying, and she would just squeeze your hand for yes. So the next day, when she was on morphine and completely gone, to the next day when she died. So I think it was incredible to watch that and see that, she kept positive, kept doing stuff right until the time when there didn't seem any point in pushing it anymore. And she kind of, to me, it looked like she had accepted it. She had accepted the fact that she was beaten. And actually, I don't like that word. I'm going to change that word because it's like losing a fight. And I don't like that. She went all the way to the end and then she accepted it. So it was acceptance more than, losing a fight. It was complete acceptance of the situation, in my opinion.
And in very simple terms, she lived until she died.
And do you know what, Jason? I like to see life as, I have this little analogy that life is a horse race. And we all start at the beginning of the race. And some of us have an end that's not very far away. Some have an end that's a reasonable distance away. And some have an end, like my mother-in-law at 96, that goes on and on and on. And during that horse race, there will be times when you'll be trotting and it'll be lovely. And you'll be smelling the roses and looking at life and thinking, life is fantastic, smiling all the way as you're trotting. And then you start galloping and you think, oh my word, I don't know if I'm really enjoying this, but it's quite exciting. Let's go with the gallop. And then the horse will do a jump and you'll think, geez, I'm not sure this is great. And then you'll fall out the saddle and your foot will be in the stirrup and you'll think, am I ever going to get in that saddle again? And you'll heave yourself up and you'll hold on for grim life. And then you get through that. And then it'll start trotting again. You'll think, okay, this is nice. And then it'll go into a walk and it'll be like, this is so dull. This is really boring. I'm not enjoying this. Okay, trot again. And that's life. It goes through the good times. It goes through the bad times. You get to the end. And I think if you get to that end line and you can look back and you can say, that was a good ride. That was a great race. I played my best ride and my best race. Then it doesn't matter so much if that line is closer. The end line was closer than you'd hoped for. And I look at Lucy and I think she had an amazing life. She lived her life. She was the most amazing person. She was a fantastic friend and mother. And we all loved her right till the end. And her legacy goes on. So, with her, it was a shorter race. My mother-in-law, on the other hand, 96, she actually got, this is fairly recent. This is in the last couple of months. She was incredibly well for a 96-year-old. Her brain worked. She was mobile. She needed a bit of help. She had a carer that helped her. But, she was still bossy. She was still feisty. She was the matriarch of our family. She was a phenomenal woman. And then she got pneumonia, wasn't feeling well, went in. She tested positive for COVID. So she obviously caught COVID. I say it's only 2 months ago. It's not when we're all talking about COVID. But then she very quickly went downhill in ICU and was gone within a week. But, I look at that and I think 96, something is going to get you in the end. And if it's something that means you're gone in a week with, it was quick, it wasn't drawn out. We've got to be realistic. 96 is an incredible age to live to. And she died peacefully. There wasn't a huge amount of pain. I think she obviously had trouble breathing, but these days medicine means you can make that a lot easier for people. So I would say she went pretty peacefully. It was a traumatic thing to watch, I think. I think watching anybody go in ICU attached to all sorts of bits of equipment is quite traumatic. And to see that rattle breath, that is hard. And, when someone flatlines, even at the age of 96, it's tough. It's really tough. It's tough to watch that. But it's a different grief to losing your 55-year-old friend or your friend's 35-year-old son. They're very different deaths and it's different grief and it's different acceptance.
Marie Curie's mission is to close the gap in end-of-life care. We're here for anyone with an illness they're likely to die from, and those close to them. Whatever the illness, wherever you are, we're with you to the end. Find out more at mariecurie.org.uk.
Having a career that's brought you so close to the animal world, seeing the life cycle of animals, do you think that's helped on your experience of grief and bereavement and or death yourself? Do you think it's had any impact at all?
I think so, because it gives you a real understanding of the fact that we're a species and you go through a life cycle and you see how animals handle death, and they just most animals seem to just kind of get on with it quite quickly. You know, that something will die in a very dramatic way and the parent will sort of look on and then get on with life, because it's all about survival. It's tough for wildlife. I mean, just the other day, it sounds very grand, but I was actually on safari the other day with friends in Botswana, and I saw this baby giraffe that it had been killed. We didn't see it killed. And it was just covered in vultures, and there was nothing left of it. And you could see the mother in the distance looking on. I mean, my heart went out to this giraffe. I felt really sad as I looked at this giraffe, looking at her baby that had just been eaten by everything, and then the last bits of flesh taken off by a vulture. But I thought, what's that giraffe going to do now? Is it going to stand around for long, grieving? No, its grief will be very short. And then it will just probably get on with living and surviving and eating and procreating again. You know, it's very different for wildlife than it is to our species. And yet, you know, I've worked with elephants and I've seen real grief in elephants. I've seen young orphaned elephants that have lost their mother and their herd, and we've rescued them, and they've stood around for weeks grieving with their trunks hanging low and looking depressed. What do we know? We're not in their minds and we can't converse with them. But yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen some animals look very, very sad. So yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, you know, you see other wildlife that's brutal to each other. You know, on the watches last year, we had 2 buzzard siblings and one pecked the other to death. It pecked its own sibling to death and shoved it out the nest and got on with its life. There was no grieving on that sibling, I'm telling you. So I think we can learn from wildlife, but I think more than learning from wildlife and understanding how other species grieve, I think wildlife and the natural environment has hugely helped me with my grief. And I know that getting out into nature is somewhere that I can be at peace, somewhere that I can be with my thoughts and declutter, and somewhere that I feel lighter. And shortly after Lucy's funeral, I filmed The Pilgrimage, which was a BBC programme with 7 celebrities go on a pilgrimage, and ours was in North Wales. And it was very poignant for me to do that at that time. When I started it, I wondered whether it was the right time to do it, because obviously we're being filmed and that's not easy. And I was with 6 celebrities who I didn't know. And obviously they're not going through grief and I am. So there were times when I felt a little isolated because, you know, pilgrimage was an amazing thing and there was a lot of laughs and it was good fun. But I found myself in my quiet moments and having to take myself away from the group at times and just grieve. But I think doing that walk, even with the cameras and 6 other celebrities, was an incredible gift at that time. And also to meet people that are spiritually connected. Doesn't matter that I don't particularly align with their religion. Nevertheless, they were spiritually connected, kind people that had time to be gentle with you. And I think in this world, we don't give each other the time to be gentle sometimes. And in the old days, you'd wear a black armband so people knew that you were going through grief. And people would just be that little bit kinder to you and more gentle. Whereas now you don't, and you're expected to just get on with it. Pick yourself up and move forward. And yes, sometimes that works, but sometimes you just need that kindness. And so to be able to talk to people, to priests, to vicars, to Buddhist monks, was a real gift at that time. And they gave me kind words and kind thoughts. And it was very thought-provoking and helpful.
And there's some really key messages in all that you just said there, Michaela. I was thinking about the survival you described of the animals in the animal world, and actually people I speak to from a human bereavement point of view talk about, especially in those early days, weeks and months, just feeling like they're surviving as well, actually, and that, you know, they're feeling very robotic and almost kind of walking through life like a robot, and the world's going on around them, and actually they're just kind of eating and sleeping and surviving to get through that bit. But I think also that thing of the world going on around them, people around them, I think you've just said something so important there for those who might have someone they know, whether it's a friend or a family member, who's grieving, about knowing what's best to do. And as you say, just being kind, being compassionate, listening and being there. And I think maybe that's all it sometimes needs, isn't it? Because, you know, you are feeling vulnerable and fragile when you're grieving and confused sometimes. And so just to be surrounded by kindness is important, isn't it?
I think that's it. It's the gentleness and the kindness. And also, with some people, it is very difficult to know how to behave and what to say to people because they don't know how to behave. You know, when you get a shock like my friend did with losing her son, you know, she didn't know how to react. She didn't know how to behave. And sometimes all of us around her said something that irritated her. And I think you just got to, as a friend, accept that. You just suck it up. And just continue to be kind in the best way that you can and not get upset yourself that, you know, your friend has got irritated with you because you thought you were saying the right thing and it wasn't the right thing at that time for that person. And it can be difficult because you can feel like you're treading on eggshells a bit sometimes. And I don't think we talk about grief enough, which is the reason, Jason, I agreed to come on and talk about grief on the podcast, because one thing we know is we are going to die. We know that. And yet we don't talk about it. And it just seems extraordinary that people feel so awkward talking about death. And yet it is going to happen to all of us. And I went to a death cafe. A friend invited me to a death cafe. Never heard of it, never thought about it. And off we went. And it was just really interesting. A lot of my friends are like, oh my God, what did you go to a death cafe for? And I said, because I think we do. We need to talk about it. We need to accept it more. And this was a friend that actually studied to be a death doula, which is basically just like you have somebody that brings life into the world, a doula that brings life in. You have a doula that takes people out of the world. And when my sister-in-law was dying of cancer, I was keen for her to see somebody that could just make her feel like she'd accepted it and not frightened of it. And I think fear as you're dying must be just awful. And so to be able to talk to someone that takes that fear away of dying is really useful, just as it is having somebody that helps you bring a life into the world, having someone that helps that life depart this world. I'm not someone that's convinced about life after death. I don't really know what I believe. I've explored it in my own head and I haven't come to any conclusions. But we are leaving this world when we go. Where we go, as I say, is still a bit of a mystery for me. But I do feel that we do need help to leave the world. And I think a death doula is an incredible thing to be.
Do you ever think about your own death?
I've always thought that I'm not particularly frightened of my own death. I think, you know, having a child, my son's 18 now, certainly 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, that for a mum is the biggest fear of, you know, leaving your child. And particularly for me, when I was diagnosed, my son, bizarrely was the same age as my stepkids were when they were told their mum had cancer. So, you know, I was just thinking, I just can't believe that Ollie is going through this at the same age as his half brothers and sister had to go through it. And we had to be incredibly careful how we explained my cancer to Ollie, because he was very aware at the age of 8 that his half brothers and sister lost their mum to cancer. We didn't want him to associate cancer with death. So we had to really explain to him that, there are good cancers and there are bad cancers, and mummy's got a good cancer that, we can get rid of. And it's just like an operation, and I'm going to be fine. Because, as I say, in his young head, cancer meant death. So, you have to be so careful when you're explaining it to young minds. But so going back to your question, have I thought about my own death? I think when you have a cancer diagnosis, you can't help but think about it. And I think I've had, like my friend Lucy, I've had an incredible life. I've lived my life. I've had some fantastic highs. Obviously, there's been lows as well. Everybody goes through lows. By the time they get to my age, 58, we've been through lows. But I think the highs outweigh the lows, and I think I've lived a life. And so I have thought about my own death, not to any great extent. I don't sit around pondering it too much, because I think it's more important to think about living when you are alive than think about dying. But yeah, I've certainly done my will. I've thought about my letter of wishes and all that sort of thing. Thought about all the crap that someone's going to have to go through when I die and sift through it. But I don't think I'm terrified of dying like some people are. So I think I wouldn't be as scared about it as some people are. But who knows? It's easy to say that.
We as an organisation encourage those conversations, about, in a practical sense, about death. So even when somebody doesn't have an illness or a diagnosis and they're young and healthy, to just have, as you've described, it can be just a one-off conversation or a series of shorter conversations. It's not something that needs to happen all the time, but actually you can write a will. You can write what your funeral wishes are. And once you've got that done, you can put it in an envelope, you can put it in a drawer, and then you can carry on living. But those practical things can be real lifesavers for those left behind. I say lifesavers for want of a better word. But for those left behind, because when you're grieving, as you've experienced yourself, you've got enough going on without having to then make lots of decisions about what happens with people's finances and or funerals, etc. So I think they're really helpful points.
You're absolutely right, Jason. And the deaths or the losses that I've experienced in the last year, I haven't been the one that's had to sort out the paperwork afterwards. But I do know from talking to people, it can be such a nightmare if people haven't got a will and haven't got a letter of wishes. My friend Lucy, as I said to you, she liked to be organised. She wrote her own eulogy. And she wrote how she wanted her own funeral. And, as we were all sitting there, of course you smile. And she started it off. She got obviously somebody to read it, and she didn't record it herself. She got someone to read it. But she said, as you know, I like to be the centre of attention, kind of hoping this wouldn't be the occasion. And of course we all smiled. She made it easy for us. She wrote the songs she wanted. She practically put the photos together, I think. So she'd thought about it. But then again, she had time to think about it. She knew that she was dying. I think it's when people don't know. I mean, I know that I haven't updated my will for 10 years. It's on my list of things to do. And no doubt it'll stay there for another 6 months until I get around to doing it. But at least I've got something in place. But you do have to keep thinking about it, particularly if you've got children. And particularly in, modern day, when a lot of families are unconventional, when they're mixed families, who does it go to? And there's nothing worse than when somebody dies, an argument between stepbrothers and sisters and, all sort of blended families. It's just horrible. It's really horrible. My mother-in-law's, we're still going through that. As I say, I'm not directly involved, but my partner is currently going to her house and clearing it all up with his brother and sister. That seems to be going fairly easily at the moment, fairly straightforward. She had a will and at 97 or 96, then you're really silly if you don't have a will written out. And so it seems to be fairly straightforward. But I was talking to a friend recently who lost her husband, and it was very unexpected. And she just said the business side of it, he owned the business, she said, has just been awful, unbelievably stressful. She didn't even know where to start. So, of course, it's not a fun thing to do, but I think you've just got to put that hat on of, let's just do this with a smile on our faces while we're well and healthy, and let's just think this through. And people get very maudlin about it. I don't think you need to. I think you need to sit there with a glass of wine or whatever you're drinking and say, right, let's put a piece of paper on the table. We know we're going to die at some point. Let's think about this. What would we like? I mean, other people like my mother. Oh my gosh, my mum she loves rings. And so she's decided that everyone's going to have a ring. But she was one short with all the people she wanted to give. So she was going to buy a new ring so that everyone got a ring. I'm like, Mum, I'm not really sure that's the right way to go around this. I said, I'll tell you what, I'm sure my son Ollie doesn't need one of your rings. It's very sweet of you, but just please don't buy a ring just so you can leave it to her when you die. That's absurd. But I love the attitude.
Yeah, I do too. I've got two more questions. One, is legacy something that's important to you? So how you'd like to be remembered?
It's tricky, isn't it? Because when you're a public figure, which I guess that's what I am, in the UK at least, I guess you do leave a legacy behind. And funny enough, I was thinking about this the other day because I've been thinking a lot about David Attenborough. He's 98. You know, a lot of people are talking about the fact that how long will David Attenborough be with us? What legacy does he leave behind? And for his 98th birthday, I was asked to sort of do a thing about what an amazing person he's been throughout his life and what is he leaving behind. And I was thinking, you know, I guess my legacy is, I hope that I've paved the way for female wildlife presenters, because I've had quite a long career already. You know, I'm nearly up to 40 years of presenting on television. Wildlife I've been doing for over 35 years. And I don't think there's been any female presenters that spring to mind, wildlife presenters, that have been that consistent for that long. So I really hope that I've paved the way for many female wildlife presenters behind me. I mean, I see them. There's lots of fantastic younger people that I reckon will do so well in the next 10 years doing wildlife presenting. And if I've helped that path, then that's certainly a legacy I'd be very proud of. And I think as well, just inspiring people to love the natural world. And, you know, we get it now. You know, Chris Packham and myself get it now. You know, we watched the Really Wild show and you inspired us. And now we're a vet, or now we're a conservationist, or we're into sustainability or whatever. I mean, that's already something that I'm really proud to say that I've inspired people to get into the natural world. So I guess that is the legacy I would like to leave behind.
Fantastic. And my last question is there anything you particularly wanted to say, Michaela, today on the podcast that I've not asked about?
I think one of the best ways to cope with grief is to get into the natural world. They call it the healing power of nature, and they call it that for a reason, because nature does have the power to heal, and it has the power to connect you with what's important in life, to have quiet time to think about memories, to think about the legacy people have left behind, to think about their life. And I think it's really important to also declutter. You know, when you go for those walks, particularly if you're grieving, then take the earpods out. You know, even if you're listening to this podcast, you know, take them out. Have the natural sounds around you. Don't always have information overload in your brain. I don't think us humans were designed to have so much information thrown at us all the time. Our brains are bombarded with information overload. And I think every so often, for our own mental health, and particularly your mental health when you're going through grieving, you need to declutter, get rid of what's not important, and focus on what's important in your life and connect with what's important in your life. And nature can really, really help you do that.
Michaela Strachan, thank you for joining me on the Marie Curie Couch today. Thank you for sharing some of Lucy's story and bringing the memory of the others who you've mentioned today. And it's been an absolute joy to meet you.
Well, thank you, Jason, for what you're doing, because I don't think that there are enough of these conversations. And, I've listened to some of your podcasts and they're really helpful. And I think when people are grieving, it is great to be able to listen to other people that have words of advice and comforting, kind words and time.
So that's all for this episode of On the Marie Curie Couch. We hope it's got you thinking about matters of life and death, and perhaps starting those conversations with your own friends and family. Marie Curie's here to help. From planning ahead to coping with bereavement, you can talk through any concerns you have around the end of life with our support line team, which also includes specially trained nurses. Call us on 0800 090 2309 or search Marie Curie online. This podcast is produced and edited by Marie Curie with support from Ultimate Content. The music featured is Time Lapse by Pan Oceanic. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please do like and subscribe. Thanks for listening, and until next time, goodbye.